Hi, I'm George Yancey. Let's share some paradigms. And the paradigm I want to share today concerns masculine Christianity. Masculine Christianity. Now, this is something that I have just observed on social media more than anything else. And one of the things that got me kind of on this was I was having an engagement with a Christian man on social media, and we had a disagreement. And I guess I may have been getting a little chippy on him, and probably said some things that were probably not the most respectful. And I try to do better. I don't always do as well as I should. And he got irritated. And he said something that was really interesting. He said, "Well, you would not say this if you were in my presence because my masculinity would intimidate you." And I thought, really? What are you going to do? Beat me up? I mean, what do you mean by that? But it got me thinking that there is a group of Christians, male Christians, who really emphasize sort of being a sort of a masculine Christianity. Now, maybe it's just talk on social media. Maybe in real life they're not this way, and that is definitely a possibility. But I do sense that there's this sort of attitude about masculine Christianity today that I think we really need to think about more carefully. Now, back in the early part of the 20th century, there was talk about a muscular Christianity. This is a little bit different. It was more about, staying in shape and, looking masculine as far as the muscles and bodybuilding perhaps a little bit. I don't know if it was directly bodybuilding, but, being strong, doing those sort of strong things. And, it may be sort of a forerunner of this as far as for men, their Christianity comes out through their masculinity. And I've done a video talking about how men sometimes have not been treated well by identity politics. So I'm not one of these who say that if you act masculine at all, it's toxic masculinity. I think that's been a very dangerous pattern that we've used. So hear me out on this. I'm not talking about being masculine is wrong. Being male is wrong. Having certain male traits. I do believe that men tend to have certain tendencies that women don't have. I'm raising 3 young boys. I see things in them that I do not see in those young girls, okay? So I'm not talking about that, but this sort of overemphasis that my Christianity is based on my maleness. And that's problematic. You see, I tend to think that masculinity and femininity are both necessary in the Christian walk. And I'm not ashamed to say that sometimes, I have a little bit of femininity that comes out. Nothing extravagant or anything like that. But what we call femininity, caring and nurturing, I'm more masculine than feminine. I'm sure, people will tell you that. But I do have some of that nurturing, that caring. And that's part of Christianity too. There's a strength, yes. There's a place for aggression, yes. But there's also a place for caring, for nurturing. And I think all of us, male, female, should have some of both. And it's all right for us to have more of one than the other. That's fine. I'm not saying 50-50. But how can you say you're a Christian and not want to engage in caring about others, in nurturing others? This sort of masculine Christianity is not big on forgiveness, I've noticed. It's big on attacking the secular forces that are trying to invade our Christian spaces. I've noticed that, it's about being strong, being a man, and, we're going to go to battle. Now, is there a place for that? Yes. But there's also a place for forgiveness, for being sensitive to the needs of others, for nurturing. There's a place for that as well. And I find precious little of that among those who express this sort of masculine Christianity. And so the problem is that we get this imbalance. And if you want to say that the talk about toxic masculinity has created imbalance towards femininity, I would agree with you. But this is an imbalance as well. It's an imbalance about all muscular, all strong, and none of the caring and compassion. That to me is a critical part of our Christian walk. How can you read the Gospels? How can you read, about God nurturing others, caring for us, and think that all Christianity is about power and defeating your enemies and going to war and going to battle? I just don't think you can. So this sort of masculine Christianity tends to ignore important elements of our faith, elements that we need, elements that we should live out as much as we possibly can. And I think it's a distortion. And part of the distortion is that, well, I think it does, and I think the people who do this don't realize this, is they're taking our cultural definitions of masculinity and imposing it on our Christian faith. Now, these individuals would see this if they were talking about progressive Christians, that they would critique as, you all have gone to society and redefined our Christian faith as part of our liberal society or progressive society. And they would have a point. I think that is a critique one could have of progressive Christians. But they're doing the same thing. They're saying that this type of masculinity that we see here, we define here in the United States, this is kind of true Christianity, at least for men. And I don't think it is. I think parts of it can be part of our Christian faith and should be part of our Christian faith, but our Christian expression is not reducible to just being masculine in the American sense. And when we're doing that, we are engaging in cultural Christianity every bit as much as the progressive Christians that these individuals will be quick to criticize. I think that any time we let any human subculture subsume our Christian walk, we're in danger of taking our Christian faith and secularizing it to what's in our culture or subculture rather than what's in the Bible. Okay, once again, to be clear, men have a right to be masculine. There are good things about masculinity. There are times of protection. I know that myself, as a husband, as a father, that I have an instinct to protect my wife, my boys. And that's a good thing. But that can become unbalanced. And when you get to the point where you're kind of physically threatening someone, saying, if you're in my presence, my masculinity will intimidate you. If you get to that point, you have to ask, the question, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus try to intimidate people with masculinity? Even in the story about driving the money changers out, he doesn't whip people, he whips animals. I don't think Jesus is about, this sort of hyper masculinity. And if we're at that point, and if that's something you're thinking about, maybe you need to think about, how can I dial this back? I'm not asking you to get rid of your masculinity, but how can I dial it back to where it doesn't become the total of my faith? So, masculine Christianity, there's a place for it, but let's not go overboard. Did this share some paradigms? Paradigms about a Christianity that's more masculine than scriptural, and how we can live that out in a way that God would be glorified. If this is interesting, then please comment. If you disagree, comment. If this is the sort of conversation you want to have, I want to build a community where we can discuss these things. I come not from the left or the right, but I really try to put my faith, my Christian faith, where I see it fitting. So if this is the sort of conversation you want to have, consider subscribing. The more we can get people to subscribe, the better conversations we can have, the more we can learn from each other. But thanks for coming by. And please come back. We can shatter some more paradigms.